Hey, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining us today. This is another showcase of the people and the stories that you'll find on Palabra, our platform for freelance members of NAHJ. Now, today, this is a conversation I've been waiting for some time, have anticipated greatly. I want to welcome to our stage Bill Gentile. He is the director and executive producer of the documentary Freelancers Mexico, which was an in-depth look at the intrepid freelancers who've been covering conflict in Mexico and Latin America. Now, Bill is also a professor in the School of Communications at American University. And by the way, he's the advisor to the campus chapter of NHJ, proudly the first such chapter in our nation's capital. And he's also one of the first NHJ members we profiled in Palabra. This is now going back a couple of years, but it was great to have him be one of our first subjects of a profile on Palabra. But today, Bill is with us to talk about his fantastic new book, Wait for Me, True Stories of War, Love, and Rock and Roll. You got to get that order just right. Okay? This is Bill's memoir of his time covering conflict around the globe, but especially in Nicaragua and El Salvador. I want to welcome Bill to this important conversation because personally for me, it's a bit of a mirror. It's a bit of a professional mirror for me. I spent 10 years covering Latin America from my seat in Mexico City for the Dallas Morning News and Knight Ridder. This was between 1997 and 2006. This was after the civil wars and after that conflict, and it in no way matches, the harrowing experiences that you had in your time there. I mean, yes, I ran into some conflicts of my own with gangsters and cartel chiefs and whatnot. But listen, reading your book was just a reminder of not just the danger, but the importance of that story and the important work that you and a band of brave correspondents took upon themselves to bring us the truth of what was happening in what was the last frontier of the Cold War a few decades back. So welcome, Bill, and thanks for joining us for this conversation today. I wanted to start by asking you what I believe is perhaps the most critical question of this conversation is, and I'll preface this by reminding you of the old adage that we heard. I heard from my editors and my mentors in the early days that says, most journalists have a good book in them, but unfortunately for most of them, that's pretty much where that book should stay. I'm glad that you neglected that advice and brought us this fantastic story of your time in Central America and Latin America, because I think it's a really good reminder of what we went through, not just as journalists, but also as a nation. In reading the pages and reading how you put yourself out there, it really begs for me the first question is, what was it that drove this desire that you had to bring this book out to the public and to educate us basically on what happened during that time, and to introduce us to a time in our history that still resonates, that's still so important for a large swath of our population here in the United States?
Ricardo, first of all, thanks a lot for having me on the program. I'm really honored to be here with you once again. I really enjoy Palabra, and I think it's making a major contribution to what we all want to happen, and that is greater diversity in the media across the United States and beyond. It's great to be here with you. I've been carrying the stories that are included in this book. I've been carrying these stories around for 4 decades now. Behind me is a picture of one of the many tens of thousands of images that I made for Newsweek magazine covering the Contra War in Nicaragua during the 1980s and the Salvadoran Civil War at the same period of time. And these folks here in this picture are an integral part of the story that I tell in this book. we all carry these stories around, particularly folks like you and I who travel to foreign countries and try to explain what's happening there. We carry them around for us, in us for a long time, but somehow, at least in my case, they really pushed themselves out. They needed to get told, they wanted to get told, and finally, I've been able to do that. I have the great good luck and good fortune of still owning the tens of thousands of photographic images, black and white, color, video, material that I've generated over 4 decades of working in the field, plus thousands of pages of my own writing in journals, in the articles that I've written, in the captions that I've written for Newsweek magazine and United Press International, in letters to friends and family and colleagues, official documents and so forth. I have this treasure chest of information, visual and print, that up until a couple of years ago was contained in boxes in my closet in Washington, D.C. Most of that material now is in the archives and special collections section of the library at American University, where I've been teaching since 2003. And they're protected from light, protected from moisture, protected from heat and cold. So I understood, at the time that I was covering these major stories in Latin America, I understood that I was covering very, very important issues that someday we're going to continue to resonate as they are right now. So that was, the fact that these stories were pushing their way out of me, and I had the information with which to tell them, was a really important factor. Not only that, I understand clearly that I've got many, many more days behind me than I have days in front of me. So, it was like, okay, either get this done now or it might not happen. But there are other factors involved. One of them is a major factor, is that I wanted to push back on this notion of the media as fake news and enemy of the people. This is something that we see happening not just in this country, but in other countries around the world. But those countries and those leaders, those authoritarian leaders, take license from what happens where I live in Washington, D.C., and they use that license to repress and to stifle and to silence their own critics. And we know what happens when they do that. So I really wanted to push back on this false notion about fake news and enemy of the people. Also, I guess finally, is the fact that we see the results of these stories, the results of U.S. intervention in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, in so many countries around the world. We see the bitter fruits still manifesting themselves today. And so I wanted to paint a picture, build a story about what happened 40 years ago, 30 years ago in places like Nicaragua and El Salvador, how that still resonates today in our country, particularly along the southern border with Mexico, where tens of thousands of these people want to come here to escape the bitter fruit of what happened back then.
Yeah, and what I think is real critical here too is, and it's really good that you brought that up, because we make a lot of comparisons with journalism the way it was back then for us and what it's like today, right? With differences in technology, the immediacy that social media affords us. But I got to tell you, just read the first opening pages of your book, and you are instantly brought to this level of personal, close-up violence, personal stories that I think once a reader sees that and feels that, they're caught into this fantastic tale that you've told here. But also, it's a reflection of the style of journalism that I think that really put this issue, that geopolitical conflict, right into the screens and the pages of American audiences a few decades ago. And it's a textbook example of how you tell stories. And if you wouldn't mind, just from the beginning in the prologue, you set the scene for the book. I think you have a little bit there that you can read for us that sort of sets the stage for us in the book.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. As you say, this is from the prologue of the book. It's only like a page and a bit long, but I think it really captures, the human cost of war, the drama of men fighting to kill each other, and which is what war is all about. It's a nasty business. So here we go. A colleague and I are bombing down a dirt road in the mountains of northern Nicaragua when a couple of Sandinista army vehicles are coming at us from the opposite direction. These are the Jeep-style vehicles used by the Sandinista field commanders in their war against CIA-backed Contra rebels, and it turns out that the driver in the lead vehicle is Lieutenant Francisco Noel Talavera, and we both slam on the brakes to say hello. Talavera is a 19-year-old from the northern mountain city of Jinotega. He has a bad complexion and the habit of spitting through the gap in his upper two front teeth. He also happens to be the commander of 3 of the 7 companies of the elite Simón Bolívar Battalion of the Sandinista People's Army. Talavera has an extraordinary sense of himself, of the importance of his role, and of his ability to execute that role. There's a cordiality between us from the start. By this time covering the conflict, I had been on so many missions with the soldiers and had gotten to know the battalion commanders so well that they would just take me out into the field with them whenever I showed up. I'm a photojournalist covering the war anytime I want to, as opposed to doing what the rest of the MOOCs in the Foreign Press Corps are required to do before heading north to the mountains. They have to go through the Sandinista Defense Ministry with a written request that could take weeks or forever to get through the bureaucracy before getting a written permit to go north where the war is actually being waged. On this morning, Talavera asks if I would like to accompany him and his troops on a mission. So my colleague and I look at each other and go something like, fucking A. It's the end of a long hike when Talavera's scouts spot the Contras on a nearby hillside. He waits for his enemies to settle around their campfires on top of the hill, allowing his own men a more visible and more compact target. Talavera pulls his soldiers, all of them crawling on their stomachs, up to the clearing on our hill to positions that enable them a clear shot at the enemy. The peasants whose home is situated on the edge of the clearing where Talavera's men take position crouch behind their rough-hewn board hut. Scratched into the slats of wood are etchings made by the hand of a child. They look like cave drawings left by Neanderthals in dark European caverns. But these don't show woolly mammoths or sleek gazelles. These show gigantic birds, monsters really, breathing fire. Their huge eyes are made of glass. They have strange circular wings mounted on their backs. Stick figures of people lie dead on the ground. Helicopters, dead Sandinistas, dead Contras, dead peasants.
Yeah.
And that's the way much of this war took place. The war in Nicaragua, the Contra War, was much more like the conflict in Vietnam than it was like World War II. There were very, very, very few, sustained frontal confrontations between the Sandinista army and the Contras that were trying to overthrow the Sandinista regime. It was a series mostly of ambushes and many times just chance encounters in the mountains. And, the fighting would last for 5, 10, 15 minutes and it was over.
Yeah.
And then you looked around for the men who were bleeding and still alive.
Right. And, Bill, the stories in this book together form an arc, I think a narrative thread that to me, and excuse the word, but to me sort of form are an epitaph to a style of journalism, a line of journalism that really doesn't exist anymore. I mean, the foreign correspondent, right? Today with so much social media and the advantages of technology and importantly, the shrinkage of our business, we see less and less of this close-in personal coverage by professionals. And it just begs a question in my mind, I mean, is journalism today better off for that? Is journalism better today than it was back then? Can we cover things in the same fashion with the same personal touch via Twitter, via Facebook, via other social media avenues? How do we adapt to this new world? And I think, you mentioned the phrase earlier, and it's also another part of your book that I'd like for you to read a little bit. It's about the human cost of war. And I think because of our distance now from a lot of this, and the fact that we have fewer and fewer foreign correspondents out there able to do this from a professional platform, we are now a distance away from that human cost. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but I would love for you to read a little bit from, I think it's on page 12 or 11. But I think just as a good reminder of where we are today in journalism and foreign
Sure.
correspondence.
Yeah, as you understand, Ricardo, I think our craft is under attack today. It's being attacked by authoritarian leaders. It's being undermined on one hand, made more powerful and effective. The other hand, undermining it by technology. You mentioned my series, the Freelancers series, about the young men and women, like the people who I teach at American University. I encourage people to consider reporting not just from the United States, but from abroad. It's harder for them. It's more dangerous for them today. There are fewer and fewer bureaus open around the world. And what's happening to the craft is that this void left by mainstream media retreating from foreign coverage, this void is being filled by freelancers. People who don't get paid as much, don't have as much experience, don't have too many times, don't have the proper training, the proper preparation to handle dangerous situations overseas, or very complex situations overseas. So, and I think the world is a darker place because of that. But anyway, and can we still inform people of crucial questions like the human cost of war? I think we can. It's harder to do that. It takes more initiative. You have to be sharper and work harder than ever before, but it can be done. It can be done. I'll delve into, as you say, the introduction of this book deals with that to a degree. And it also explains why now for this book. So here we go. The stories of our lives describe what is meaningful to us. They help define who we are. The stories I pass on in this book form the account of one man's embrace of and struggle with war, love, family, a profession, and self. I've carried these stories with me for decades, and for decades they have yearned to be released, to be shared, to be told. I tell these stories now because I believe they contain something of value to researchers seeking information about the historic events that swept over Central America in the late 1970s, 1980s, and early 1990s. Value to young men and women who aspire to use the craft of journalism, especially photojournalism, video journalism, and other forms of visual communication, to engage and to document their own times and experiences. Value to all who might learn something of the human condition, seen through the prism of one man who lived through those times and those experiences, and who is willing to write about them. These are more than just stories about war. They are a collective statement about journalism and the men and women who practice it, about the decisions we make, about what we aspire to achieve, about the people and the stories that we tell. Perhaps more importantly, and this is a key to the whole mixture here. Perhaps more importantly, this book introduces the American people who sponsor those faraway conflicts to the victims of U.S. military intervention abroad. We intervene in foreign countries supposedly for freedom and democracy, but few Americans ever see the faces of collateral damage or know the names of the dead and wounded in those battles. Wait for Me is a firsthand frontline account of the human cost of war. You know, in a review for this book, Alan Riding, who is a famous and just, you know, an extraordinarily accomplished a foreign correspondent, a British guy.
Yes.
He's just you know, head and shoulders above the many of his colleagues. But I had the great honor of having him review the book, and he was of course the New York Times bureau chief in Mexico, Latin, and Central America when all of these revolutions were going on. And he astutely remarked that, you know, I not only covered these conflicts in Central America, I actually lived them. You know, my first wife is Nicaraguan. She worked for the Sandinista government early during the revolution. Her family was deeply connected to the Sandinista revolution. I'm pretty certain that they would not be very happy about, you know, the situation today. But, you know, at the beginning of the revolution, they were very much in favor of the social objectives of the Sandinista government. They adopted me pretty much, you know, and I got to see, I was so privileged because of my relationship with them. I got to see the Sandinista world from the inside out. You know, my first wife's youngest brother was badly wounded in combat. He was a member of the Sandinista People's Army, and he's handicapped to this day. He's blind, you know, has serious health issues, but you know, their relationship with the revolution, especially, and just being Nicaraguan, I was able to kind of get a sense of the dynamics of Nicaraguan life through my relationship with them, something that very, very few journalists had the privilege to do. So again, going back to Alan Riding's review of the book, you know, he said he covered the conflicts of the region. I actually lived them.
Yeah, it's great. That sums it up really nicely. But listen, where does the title come from? Wait for Me. What's the source of that? Yeah.
You know, so many things happen at the end of this process. I mean, I started to write this book, of all places, in Havana when I was with my second wife, who was Cuban American. She was visiting family there, and I would get up at 4:30, 5 o'clock every morning, make some coffee, go outside in the patio, and write this stuff. Take my little laptop out there and you know, just put together chapters of the book and so forth. And then, of course, I got deeper into it and you know, revised my archives and drew from that. Toward the end of you know, toward the conclusion of writing the manuscript, a friend of ours, I'll call it that right now because it's a longer story than we have time for here, but a friend of ours was imprisoned in Cuba, and as was her husband. And she had access to her Facebook account, and she published a poem that was written during World War II by a very, very famous Russian author. And it was about him being assigned from being a regular journalist, being shipped off to the front lines of the battle with the Nazi troops invading the Soviet Union. And the poem was called "Wait for Me," and I was so moved by the poem, and it somehow fit so well and appropriately to my own situation, in that I had people waiting for me to return from you know, Central America, and covering pretty hairy stuff. Nothing, of course, like the Second World War, but deadly nonetheless. And so, and I spent a couple of years kind of balancing, trying to figure out the relationship between the people who raised me and the people who I drew most heavily from the people who formed me as a person, as a man, and how to include them in this book and in a meaningful way. And you know, I took the name of the poem that this woman posted on Facebook. It was called "Wait for Me," And it was all about how the people who waited for this correspondent to come back from the front lines to continue his life back in Moscow.
That's great.
I can read the poem if you want me to. It's short.
Yeah, okay. Let's hear it. And it's a really nice poem. I think everybody would appreciate hearing that.
Okay, let's see. I've got my little pink little slips here to keep my place in the book. Okay, here we go. Wait for me to return. Only the wait will be hard. Wait when the grief invades you, while you watch the rain fall. Wait when the winds sweep the snow. Wait in the suffocating heat, when others have stopped waiting, forgetting their yesterday. Wait, even when letters do not reach you from far away. Wait, even when others have tired of waiting. Wait, even when my mother and son believe that I no longer exist, and when friends sit by the fire to toast my memory. Wait. Do not rush to offer for my memory you too. Wait, because I will defy all deaths, and let those who do not wait say, I was lucky. They will never understand that in the midst of death, you, with your weight, you saved me. Only you know how I survived. It's because you waited, and the others did not.
Yeah, it's great.
Pretty powerful stuff. This is
a
reduced version.
No, and it's so apt. It fits nicely with the tenor of your book, and the, as I said, the arc of this memoir. And one of the things that I really found interesting in terms of a technical and writerly kind of a device that you rarely see in memoirs is, and it reveals, I think, a way that we construct these biographies and autobiographies is through correspondence. We have conversations with people who were with us, who were co-witnesses of what we saw, and we include that as research in our narratives. But what I like what you did in what you've done in this book is that you've actually verbatim listed some of the answers to your questions that you got back from people that were there with you. And for a lot of us who came after you guys out in the field, it's like seeing the inner thoughts of people like Juan Tamayo and Bruno Lopez, people who we sort of idolized when we started our journeys in Latin America. So in getting those correspondences back from these guys and these people, did you find something, did you discover something about yourself that perhaps you had overlooked and needed someone outside looking in to remind you of? Was there something in this process that you can label as a piece of self-discovery?
Yeah, this whole book was a journey for me, really. And I guess writing a memoir for anyone is a journey. I wasn't sure how this thing was going to turn out. I just started to put these things down. I went back to my journals and found stories that I had completely forgotten about, and they awaken all of these memories and they come alive again. And you mentioned Juan Tamayo and Bruno Lopez. I sent the manuscript of this book to both of them and to a couple of other guys. One of them, Joe Contreras, my Newsweek colleague. And they read the manuscript before it was published, and they reminded me of things and corrected me on a number of issues that I had gotten or put down incomplete in the book. So it was just an extraordinary journey into self, into how I fit in the world, and I'm still getting that feedback from colleagues, who are working around the world doing other things now. They read the book and they comment and say, hey, what about this and what about that, and you forgot this, and so it was a wonderfully gratifying, sometimes sad, sometimes very happy re relearning, re-experiencing the past. I tell my students, don't throw away part of your personal history. That no matter what they are, letters from your family, pictures that you've made, love letters, even from people who dumped you, all of these things, they're part of your life. Don't throw them away.
It's a good reminder that this is the reason why we keep our notebooks, right?
That's right.
And you put the start and end date on the inside cover of those notebooks, just so you could have a reference to that time in your life. Because believe me, we all start looking at ourselves retrospectively at different stages, and this is a good reminder of that. But your story is also very interesting for another dimension. And this is another thing I like about this book is that you don't leave out your own backstory and how you got to Central America. I mean, it's not like you just one day decided, hey, there's a war down there, and I'm going to go take some pictures from it, right? Yeah, no, and I think that's why I think it's very fascinating, your own family's background, which you go into in this memoir, and I think it's a very important part of the book. I'm glad.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you. The past and the present, for me at least, and the part of me that went to Central America, and the part of me that prepared me for going to Central America, I can't pull them apart. And the trick was for me to like blend them in a way that was coherent and that was accessible for a reader. How to tell the story properly. I'm a product of my mother and my father were both born in Italy. They're Italian immigrants. And the men in the family, the extended family, all went to a small steel town called Aliquippa, just outside of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh at the time was the steel capital of the world, and all the men from the village where my parents were raised, went to that town, Aliquippa, because the men could get jobs there. My grandfathers, my father, all of my uncles, my three brothers, and I worked in those steel mills. And I thank God that I did work in those steel mills to work my way through college at Penn State University, because I learned a tremendous lesson there. And the lesson was, you don't want to spend the rest of your life in these steel mills. So find a way out of them, okay? And I did. But I'm glad for the experience. These are men who were the salt of the earth. They had rough backgrounds. The mills made them rougher, but they were there relinquishing probably a third of their adulthood to working in the steel mills, which is really, really tough work, so that they could their families could prosper. I cut out another brief excerpt here about the mills, if you'd like me to read it.
Yeah, let's hear it. Yeah.
Okay. And again, the town is called Aliquippa, Pennsylvania. Yeah, it's a pretty short one. Okay. I'm talking about the steel mills where my dad worked and my brothers and I worked. I worked my way through college in these mills, and I learned very quickly that the mill assaults one's senses, wipes them out. I remember hearing the workplace long before even seeing it, coming through the tunnel that feeds workers into this Dantesque world. A deep rumble is punctuated by train whistles, the crashing of railroad cars linking together, and the horns of riverboats crying sadder than loons on the nearby river. I got through the tunnel and see it all laying along the horizon. Huge black rectangular steel buildings connected by wires with smokestacks taller than the buildings jut into the sky, eating up men and machines, spitting out smoke, fire, and steel. I step into the black and white world where everything is oversized, exaggerated, and lethal. In the summertime, the heat from the furnace and the metal that rolls out of its mouth comes at me like a wave from an explosion. In the wintertime, steel coming out of the furnace warms the air half a football field away. At nighttime, the white-hot steel turns the half-lit buildings to daytime. I understood that this was the fire that my father pointed out to us when, as kids, we drove past the place in our '56 Plymouth. It's a menacing place. Just about everything around me can kill or maim, so I kept my eyes open and my limbs under control. I watched every move, because I can lean against the wrong thing and get electrocuted. I can take a wrong step and fall to my death. I can put my hand in the wrong place and a machine will bite it off. I can look too close or in the wrong place and sparks will burn my eyes out. One of the other workers can bump against a stack of steel beams that will topple and crush my legs like a heavy boot on paper cups. Especially during the 12 midnight to 8 a.m. shift, I would take the opportunity to doze off on some of the wooden benches provided for workers during downtime. I was especially careful to keep my hands from hanging down to the ground out of concern that the rats populating the place would take a bite. Big rats. And I hate rats. I hate rats.
Join the club. I think you have a few more people in that same colony, right? But listen, I think that background actually positioned you nicely to be able to look at what was happening in Central America when you got there and feel this important empathy to the stories that were in front of you, which I believe made you an outstanding photographer and an outstanding storyteller of that period of time. And I think it also, if we look back on it now, helps us contextualize what's going on today on our Southwest borders and what's going on today in Central America, the continual push north for big numbers of people. This is a problem that has origins, that has important origins that we really need to remind ourselves constantly of. And it also brings us to, this unfortunate conflict that we have today. And it just really makes me wonder, from your perspective, what is it with Nicaragua today? What is it with Daniel Ortega? I mean, here's a man who was part of this movement that you chronicled. And now we see a really different Nicaragua. So what's going on there? What is the outlook from your perspective? And I think it's also reflective of a section of your book that deals with the Reagan years, that deals with the Central American conflicts, and carries some really nice words from our Archbishop Oscar Arnulfo Romero in the book. So if you could read a little bit of that. But first, tell me what your thoughts are about the current state of play in Nicaragua and Daniel Ortega.
The first book that I did of Nicaragua was a book of photographs. It's called Nicaragua. I did it, I think it was in 1989 it was published, toward the end of the Contra War. And neither of these books, neither this current book, Wait for Me, nor the Nicaragua book of photographs are exclusively bang bang books or exclusively combat books. They're not exclusively war. However, especially in the first book, there are lots of pictures of just daily life of people working the land, because Nicaragua is a very agricultural country, of poverty, of just the daily drama of making it from one day to the next. But it's interspersed in that I think there are about 100 pictures in the first book. Are images like this one here of conflict. And that's because, sadly, conflict has been a central part of the narrative that is Nicaragua from its very beginning. The epilogue of that first book is a long interview with then Vice President Sergio Ramirez Mercado, brilliant man, great writer, and an astute observer of his own people and his country's history. And he explains that a couple of the things that Nicaraguans are peculiar within the Central American context, in the sense that, as are these other countries, they're an amalgam of the Spanish conquistadores who came to the New World, and the nature of the people in Central America, of the indigenous people that they found when they came to the New World. So you've got these very, very different countries. Guatemalans are very different from Salvadorans. Salvadorans are very different from Nicaraguans. Facial features are different. You go to Costa Rica, you think you're in Europe. But Nicaraguans come from the people who founded Nicaragua, who first came there, the conquistadores, came from specific parts of the country where men are macho and they're fighters, and they go out and look for a fight, and they have knife in hand. And I'm quoting Sergio Ramirez right now. And people in Nicaragua were very specific indigenous folks as well. And this mixture created these people who were quite volatile. They're unbelievably friendly, but they like a good fight. And they can be absolutely unnegotiable and resilient to any type of common sense resolution of any issue. Your question is to answer your question. It's the $64,000 question in Nicaragua. What happened to these people? Is it something that's ingrained in them from all those ancient times? Is it the personality of Nicaraguans who just can't get out of this cycle of violence that keeps recurring every generation or so? And with the Sandinistas, it's especially peculiar and disheartening, because in the first conflict, the revolution, about 30,000 people died in a country that at the time had about 3 million people in it. The population, incredibly, in Nicaragua right now is about twice that size, but in the Contra War claimed another 30,000 souls. And again, this is, we in the United States, we were appalled, horrified when 3,000 people were killed in the attack on the World Trade Center. Our country had over 300 million people in it. Think about losing 60,000 people in a country with 3 to 4 million people in it.
Yeah, no, it's a huge impact, and I think it also underscores this relationship that we've had with Nicaragua, the U.S. and Nicaragua, for a long time. Yeah. And it's always been built on special interest. It's always been built on a sense of control. In the United States, we've called Central America and Nicaragua specifically our backyard.
Yep.
And so this sense of colonialism, I think, has driven a lot of what we ended up seeing, unfortunately, in that time. And it does lead to me to ask you, if you would, just read a little bit. I think it's on page 150 or so. It's the beginning to the chapter, the Reagan administration. And if you want to get a textbook example of what deadly foreign policy looks like,
okay,
it's that chapter on the Reagan administration. So.
Here we go. And you're right, this is absolutely important to remember the context of all of this, because none of this stuff happens in a vacuum, Ricardo. You know that as well as I do. It's important to remember the context of my time in Nicaragua. The Reagan administration's policy against the Sandinista government had really begun to impact the entire country, and all the positive things the Sandinistas wanted to do were put on hold just to defend itself. Nicaragua was on a war footing. The government forced to shovel 60% of its gross national product into defense. And with the help of the Soviet Union, Cuba, East Germany, and other Soviet bloc states, the Sandinistas trained, armed, and shipped off their youth to the mountains to fight the Contras, who were being recruited, trained, and armed by the United States. The war, the devastating US trade embargo, the draft, the killing, the fleeing of the youth, the exodus of the middle class, the capital flight, brain drain, the abandonment of farmland by peasants who sought safety in the cities, the subsequent disruption of the labor force and of the nation's agricultural production. All of this was happening at the same time. To the north, American military forces arrived in Honduras for, quote, exercises that bore an uncanny resemblance to U.S. preparations for invasion. Many of these forces rotated through the country, managed to leave behind tons of war material, stuff that mysteriously but inevitably found its way to the Contra forces fighting the Sandinistas. U.S. military advisors arm, train, and advise the Contras, staging raids into Nicaragua. CIA advisors teach the Contras how to neutralize Sandinista activists. In this context, neutralize means kill. To the south, Costa Rica hosts former Sandinista war hero Helen Pastora. Pastora didn't like the way the Sandinistas were going, so he launched his own war against them. He was also getting sporadic aid from the Americans. El Salvador. In El Salvador, the US-backed government is busy fighting a civil war that in 10 years will claim 75,000 lives, most of them innocent civilians killed by government forces and right-wing death squads. In nearby Guatemala, the regime is busy carrying out a scorched earth policy against the indigenous population that supports or is suspected of supporting anti-government guerrillas. And scorched earth in Guatemala means just that. It means soldiers surround the village, then go in and kill everybody and everything: men, women, children, dogs, cats, chickens, cows, monkeys, parrots. Soldiers bury the victims in mass graves or throw them into wells. Then they burn down the village, and that's how the earth gets scorched. To the great misfortune of her people, Central America had become one of the final battlegrounds of the Cold War. I believe it was Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Arnulfo Romero who once most fittingly described Central America's dilemma, caught in the middle of a struggle between two superpowers. Open quote. They provide the weapons and we provide the dead. Close quote.
Well, that's powerful, and it's so true, and it still resonates today. That story. Yep. I think that's why it's important. Hey, we have a question here from Patricia Guadalupe. Hello, Patricia. And Patricia would like our thoughts on your thoughts on this question. You know, in many revolutions, and when there's big change in society, there is a large marginalization of women involved in this change. And along with that, rampant misogyny. So it's not, and in that we see that there is often not enough said about that, the status of women in revolution, the condition of women in these convulsive changes. We saw that we've seen that in Nicaragua. We see that in conflict around the world. What are your thoughts on the condition of women and how women end up being, marginalized in some cases, being ostracized in their own villages, being targeted for violence at many levels? Do we do enough to cover that part of the story?
Thanks, Patricia. I understand your question. Before I answer it, I just want to go back and make one comment about the Reagan administration. And Ricardo, your earlier question about what's happening in Nicaragua. None of what's happening in Nicaragua today under the Ortega regime, none of this is excusable by anything that the Reagan administration did. Okay, a couple of years ago, there were demonstrations in the street, peaceful demonstrations, and Ortega's forces cut down, killed over 300 people. Many of them just peaceful protesters. So none of this is an excuse. None of what happened during the Reagan administration is an excuse for what's happening today in Nicaragua. Now, to Patricia, to your question, during the revolution, women played a very, very active role. And I don't think this is strictly the case of Nicaragua. Salvador, I think there was participation from women in the revolutionary movement as well. Not as much, I think, as happened in Nicaragua. And the Nicaraguans, the Sandinistas were very, very, they took this participation, they used the women's participation in the revolution legitimize their own political objectives. But I think some of it was quite real. After the revolution, after the revolutionary days, and when the power for struggle, the struggle for power really got on its way. I think, I think women, probably more so than ordinary civilians, ordinary people in society, were ostracized. Anybody who opposed the Sandinistas were ostracized. To be honest with you, and maybe I missed something. I don't know that the women in Nicaragua were ostracized as a matter of policy. I know that women were always kind of second-class citizens in Nicaragua, as they are in too many Latin American societies. We can go to Mexico and see, or Guatemala, and see horrific examples of misogyny, of violence against women, of almost all-out genocidal war against women. I never saw that in Nicaragua. I don't know that was a policy there. So, and that's my honest answer.
Yeah, no, and I think it's very important to point out that it's just not a problem that's limited to one conflict or one country. This is a global problem that we have, mistreatment and misogyny that's rampant in a lot of our societies. Bill, we're running a little bit short on time now. We probably want to wrap it up, but I just want to point out that for those of you who might not know this, Bill has one of the most popular classes on the campus at American University. It's the backpack journalism class. It's showing young journalists how to be their one self-contained production unit, right? And it really reminds me of a lot of the BBC reporters that you see traipsing around the globe. They have a high definition camera with them. They have a stereo recorder for audio, and they've got their laptops because they know they're going to be multitasking throughout their time abroad and throughout their careers. A lot of us were raised in this business to do one thing, pick a lane and stay with it. But I think you have set an example of what journalists today can really do to succeed, and that is to be a good storyteller on numerous platforms. And we're sort of taking a page from what you've done for Palabra, and I think it is reflective of your long career, and I hope that we can continue to do this with you and have these kinds of conversations. We do have one final question that's come in, and I think we have just enough time to answer this. This is from Marissa Chato, and she's curious to know more about, Bill, your experience in El Salvador and during that time and during the Civil War, specifically your experience witnessing that human cost of war and the American intervention in El Salvador.
That's a great question, and I do deal with El Salvador in this book, in this current book, and I'll be straight up, frank with you, and I say this in the book. I say it very clearly. I start out discussing El Salvador by stating that I never liked El Salvador, and it wasn't because of the people. It was because El Salvador had at that time extracted so much blood from so many people, and so many of these people were my friends and colleagues. John Hoagland, who was a good friend of mine, who they called John and I the suicide stringers in Nicaragua, because we were willing to do stuff that was far more silly and reckless than a lot of people were. But he was killed in El Salvador. In fact, I kind of inherited John's position as Newsweek magazine's contract photographer for Latin America and the Caribbean a year after he was killed in El Salvador. I was present at when Cornel Legros, a Dutch cameraman, was killed in March of 1989. I was there when David Blundy, a British correspondent, was shot. in November of 1989. And, you know, so it after you pull a couple of guys from the battlefield and they die, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And what happened in El Salvador was much more savage than what happened in either the Contra War or the Sandinista Revolution. I forget the exact dates now, but there's a period like from 1979 when Bill Stewart was killed by the National Guard in Nicaragua, and later in I think when 1989 when Cornell and Lundy were killed. I think there were 17 journalists who were killed covering Central America. 12 of them were killed in El Salvador. It was a really perilous place for us. So that, you know, I tell you, and I say this in the book, every time I flew to El Salvador to cover an election or a guerrilla offensive or whatever, you know, when my plane would come down and touch, the tarmac there, you know, my stomach would tighten and it wouldn't loosen up until I was on another plane out of the country, leaving Salvadoran airspace, because it was always a challenge of dealing with that violence.
Yeah.
And it was serious stuff.
Thank you, Marissa, for that great question. And on that note, I think we'll end this for now. Keep the conversation going. Follow Bill's book readings on this fantastic book, Wait for Me. We look forward to hearing more about it. I'm anxious to see the movie when it's finally made. And it will be. Hey, listen, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this hour. It's been a fantastic look back on a really important time in our history, brought to us by one of the eyewitnesses, one of the great photographers of our time, one of the great journalists of our time. And again, on behalf of Palabra and NHJ, I thank you for spending this hour with us. Hey, stay tuned. The virtual conference continues. If you haven't registered, get in there and sign up and enjoy the rest of the week of programming. There's a lot more ahead for you. And once again, thanks. And Bill, take it easy. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Ricardo. Appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, folks.